here's a picture. I think I'm actually responsible for these images. Back when I taught the course, we've been kind of like between Dan and I, we've been handing the course back and forth, and I guess I just thought this picture looked pretty, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so moving on to some important stuff. The benzodiazepines, okay, are still to this day the most commonly prescribed sedative hypnotics. They're not the most commonly prescribed psychotherapeutic or psychotropic agents for the things that the benzodiazepines were typically the most commonly prescribed for. For example, like in the case of anxiety, we've noticed that antidepressants are actually far more effective and safe. But in terms of sedative hypnotics, per se, they are the most commonly prescribed. They're most commonly prescribed, as their name implies, for anxiety and sleep, but there are other potential medicinal uses, including the treatment of convulsive disorders, as we've seen, and relief from withdrawal symptoms, okay, which is especially important in the case of alcohol withdrawal. They are the most frequently prescribed psychotropic medication in Canada, okay, representing 3 to 4% of the population for all manner of conditions, anxiety, sleep, convulsive disorders, and more, okay? The common examples include Valium, the generic name. Hope you learned that in your class on pharmacokinetics or drug classification. There are brand names like Valium, and there are generic names like diazepam. Okay, the brand name is the name that is used for marketing purposes, right? It usually sounds, almost like a kind of euphemistic plug for the thing. It's like Librium, which kind of implies it's liberating you from your, I don't know, whatever sucks, like anxiety, okay? Ativan, which is lorazepam, Xanax, which is alprazolam, and so on and so forth. There are three typical types of kind of misusers and abusers of the benzodiazepines. Again, that's a really kind of stigmatizing term. We don't mean that people are literally intentionally, I'm going to abuse this drug, like someone might abuse another person or a privilege. Okay? What we mean by that, I hope you've been introduced to this again, in terms of the continuum of substance use, is a type of relationship to a drug that has become problematic to some degree or another. Okay, the three typical types of users who develop the most problematic relationship with the benzos are first older adults who are using prescription benzodiazepines, who end up developing a tolerance and end up increasing their dosage. There are other issues around the use of psychotropics in general with the older adult population, including kind of mixing different drugs together, right? So polysubstance use because they have poly prescriptions, but the older adults here. Also, in the case of the opiates, will tend to use prescription benzos to the point where they need to increase their dose over time. Next are younger people who tend to obtain them to get high, sometimes from older adults, right? That they live with, for example, or that they just have some kind of regular, reliable access to. They might take very high doses and or mix it with alcohol in order to get high or to come down from some other drug, usually a psychostimulant like cocaine crack. Oh my goodness. And then finally, this is the category that we alluded to before. Yeah, the category of users who would be classified as people who have developed a problematic relationship with benzos because they have subclinical anxiety. They are using them not to effectively manage the otherwise unmanageable symptoms of their anxiety, but instead to cope with what we might think of as the normal range of the human experience of anxiety. And therefore, it's being used in a way that is not particularly helpful and very liable to cause problems long term. Whoa, can you say wardrobe change? Okay, that's my only joke of the day, like real joke. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, yes, you'll notice that every so often I'm not just leaving the room to change shirts because I no longer like a certain color on me while I'm recording these lectures. I am recording these sometimes in short bursts. It's a really busy and chaotic time. So anyway, sorry about that. So you'll notice these little wardrobes. Who knows? I might even come on here one time with a fully shaved face again. So we'll see. Okay, so as I said before, in the case of alcohol, whenever you see a slide that says mechanism of action, pay attention. Okay, not only is it an extremely important, testable kind of bit of information here, but really, when we're talking about the psychopharmacology, and specifically in this case, the pharmacodynamics of any given substance, what we're really talking about is what that drug is doing and how it's doing what it's doing at the level of the central nervous system, specifically the brain. That's what we mean by mechanism of action. How is it doing what it's doing? Okay, well, like alcohol, benzodiazepines are central nervous system depressants. They work by decreasing activity at the level of the central nervous system. Okay, like alcohol, they increase the actions of GABA. Okay, and at higher doses, again, like alcohol, a similar 1-2 punch. Okay, they inhibit the activity of the natural excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate. Okay, this is why alcohol and benzodiazepines share cross tolerance. And again, to bring this back from a treatment perspective, the treatment of potentially life threatening, or at the very least, very unpleasant withdrawal from alcohol, we can use benzodiazepines to help taper someone safely in the withdrawal from alcohol. Okay, unlike alcohol, however, okay, their effects are synthetically engineered. Okay, these are laboratory drugs. Okay, to be more pharmacologically selective. Okay, they're more precise. They're less messy. There's an analogy I like to use, and I'll bring it up again probably in the class on psychotherapeutics. But like, imagine that like you were trying to put oil in in your car, right? And like, imagine you just had a bucket of oil and you were just turning around and throwing it behind you. Okay. Well, some of that oil is going to land where it needs to, right? And like in a little like oil container, whatever that's called. I'm not a car guy. Wherever oil is supposed to go, some of that oil is going to land there, but not all of it will. Okay. In fact, a lot of it's just going to splash onto the engine block, and it's going to go into the windshield wiper fluid. Okay. Some of it's just going to land on the ground. Okay. But it's going to land definitely in places where the car's not supposed to receive oil. And so it's going to cause some unintended side effects and some really like brutal effects that are not good for the car. Alcohol is messy. It's a central nervous system depressant that people will use for things like anxiety and even, depression. People will use it to calm down, so to speak. And for, to a certain point, it does work for them, but it is messy. The benzodiazepines, while not being completely safe, at the very least are not messy in this way. They're far more selective in how they produce their central nervous system effect because they have been specifically engineered that way, unlike alcohol, to produce that effect. Okay, so now that we've got a better sense of what the mechanism of action is for the benzodiazepines, now that we have a better sense, in other words, of what their pharmacodynamics are, let's talk a little bit more about what we've kind of touched on already when we spoke about you know the key demographics who tend to have the most problematic relationship with these drugs, so older adults especially, younger persons who obtain them and use them recreationally. Let's kind of broaden this out a little bit. And it's a conversation, by the way, that we're going to have in more detail with respect to the opiates and then the psychotherapeutics later. So a lot of these points will just translate right over, or like at least overlap with those points later on. Okay, so in around the 1970s, okay, social problems related to the use of this class of drugs, these benzodiazepines, centered on their widespread misuse. They were just being used too much. They're being overprescribed, okay, for just about everything. Remember that conversation we had before around the difference between, like, clinical and subclinical anxiety? That's kind of what we're talking about here, okay? They're being prescribed too often, okay, and in massive, excessive doses, okay? Older adults in particular were at risk of a kind of dementia-like disorder, which can result from the chronic use of long-acting benzodiazepines. What makes them more vulnerable? Well, it's what makes older adults more vulnerable, generally speaking. And in this case, neurologically more vulnerable. Okay, we won't get into those details, but there's that fact. The more general problem here, okay, is that the benzodiazepines were being overprescribed, mainly because we weren't properly screening and assessing for the kinds of conditions for which a benzodiazepine prescription would be indicated and where it would be counterindicated, or at least not indicated, right? In the sense of, look, there are some forms of anxiety, okay, clinical forms of anxiety for which a benzodiazepine prescription is, if not necessary, it would at least be extremely helpful, and the risks of taking that drug would be outweighed by the potential benefits, the advantages. And in other cases, that's just not the case, okay? For what we might think of it as subclinical forms of anxiety or problems of everyday living. Okay, so this raises a lot of issues that, again, we'll get back to next week when we talk about the opiates, around the role of a physician, how much they should know, and just like the role of the mental health system too in properly intersecting with the non-mental health world of health services, and the broader ethical implications. You might call, like, the psychoethical implications of prescribing people with psychotherapeutic agents that are meant to deprive them, in some cases, of what is a normal human experience. I mean, to put this in a really stark way, this is not a perfectly good analogy, but imagine we had a drug that could eliminate grief. Okay, grief, if you've lost someone, okay, or you get terrible news, you lose a job or whatever, like, especially if you've lost a person. Imagine giving a drug to someone. Say we had a drug that you could give to a parent, for example, who has just lost their child, and that drug is meant to eradicate their grief, or at least turn it down by 90%, okay, so that you're not even feeling any of it. Is that something we really want to give to people? Like, grief is not major depression, okay? Grief is not, a kind of, like, psychopathology. It is a normal human response. It is, as I sometimes say in the therapy that I do, it is just the flip side of love. It's a beautiful line from Andrew Garfield, and he says in an interview, when he was talking about the death of his mother, he said that grief is just all of this unexpressed love, right? One of my favorite musicians, Steven Wilson, he puts it really well in a song of his called "Grief is Only Love." He says, grief is only love that's got nowhere to go, right? Grief is this beautiful thing, right? It's a poetic sadness, right? That we should not be so quick to shelve or to turn the volume down on. Now, if it becomes unresolved grief that just has absolutely not abated, found no kind of integration in someone's life, okay, that's a different story. But grief itself, we shouldn't be so quick to deprive ourselves of. It's actually part of a well-lived life, much like a lot of the anxiety that gets presented at a doctor's office or at a kind of intake clinic might not be something that we want to necessarily medicate. Okay, let's come back to the pharmacodynamics of the benzodiazepines, especially by understanding how we classify them, okay, right? And therefore, well, we talked a moment ago, we talked a few moments ago about how we distinguish or classify benzodiazepines in terms of their intended use, their function. More specifically, in a pharmacodynamic sense, we distinguish between different types of sedative hypnotics primarily in terms of their duration of action. How long do these drugs last? And I'm going to ask you in a moment to kind of think of, okay, wait a second, what law of dependence is that related to? Right? This idea of duration of action. I hope your answer is, wait, pause the video if you want to think of it. The answer is physical dependence. Okay, remember, okay, the longer the duration of action, okay, of a drug, like the longer it takes for it to do its full kaleidoscopic range of psychoactive effects, okay, the less likely you are to become physically dependent on it, okay? Anyway, let's go back to this. A short-acting sedative hypnotic, okay, is generally a hypnotic, okay? So a short-acting benzodiazepine is generally prescribed as a hypnotic. One of the exceptions to this, by the way, are in the case of panic disorders. There are certain types of benzodiazepines that are fast-acting and short-acting in order to address an oncoming panic episode. But usually, this is for sleep. These drugs have very high dependence liability because they act quickly and they leave quickly. Remember, acting quickly, rate of onset, okay, the faster the effects are produced, that pertains to psychological dependence. Short duration of action means high risk of physical dependence. The long-acting sedative hypnotics, okay, the long-acting benzodiazepines are more of the sedatives. Okay, these are meant to begin within about an hour or so, 45 minutes to an hour, and they can last 8+ hours. They're generally used for types of anxiety that are not crisis episodes, right? They're not episodically, crisis based. Okay, so for example, the paradigmatic example of a crisis anxiety episode is panic. Okay, so generally speaking, the long-acting benzodiazepines are less likely to produce physical dependence. Okay, the short-acting ones are more likely to produce physical dependence. We'll see a graph on the next slide here, just kind of summarizing by comparing different types of drugs. So like I said, if you look at these different kinds of drugs, they give you a sense of how quickly, right, a drug starts to produce its effects and then how long its duration of action is. As we talked about before, the barbiturates, one of the reasons why the barbiturates are rarely prescribed today, okay, and because they've been, and the reason that they've been replaced almost entirely by the benzodiazepines is because they're linked to tolerance as well as a physical and psychological dependence. Again, it makes a lot of sense. Look at public enemy number one for the barbiturates up here, secobarbital. Okay, that one has a rapid rate of onset. Okay, and a very short duration of action. It's in quick and out quickly too. Okay, compare that by contrast, way down the list, to diazepam or Valium. Okay, that has a relatively short kind of rate of onset, right? A quick rate of onset, so there's psychological dependence liability there, but a fairly low physical dependence liability. Is it non-existent? No, of course you can become physically dependent on diazepam. Absolutely. It is far less likely to become physically dependent on that drug. The other reason, though, as we've mentioned before, is that barbiturates have a much smaller window of safety, okay? A much smaller safety margin, as we say. So they have a higher potential of a lethal overdose, particularly when combined with other depressants, most commonly alcohol. This is why they are linked to many accidental overdoses, if not in some cases, deaths by suicide. In addition, the withdrawal syndrome from barbiturates is far worse than the withdrawal syndrome from the benzodiazepines, and therefore is likely to require, you know, very serious medical attention. It could be considered a medical emergency on the level of a severe alcohol withdrawal syndrome. Okay, thus the benzos are often prescribed as a first choice, and the barbiturates are only prescribed, if at all, in the kind of scientifically advanced world, in the industrialized world, and again, these terms are like highly politicized, in the developed world, so to speak, only if absolutely necessary. In other words, if benzodiazepines are not readily available. Okay, so over the next two slides, we're going to talk about two benzodiazepines that, well, for some of you, you may not have heard very much about, but these benzodiazepines have a kind of really kind of light and dark side sort of history here, right? It's a really mixed bag. On the one hand, they are extremely highly effective pharmacological agents, okay, and even highly highly effective from a therapeutic medicinal perspective. They are also, okay, extremely dangerous for similar reasons, and they are associated, this is the really dark part, with cases of sexual assault and sexual exploitation. Okay? In other words, they are used, as I talked about before in another context, they are often used, unfortunately, as sex assault weapons. The first one of these is called Rohypnol. It's been given the street name Roofie, some other names as well. The generic name of Rohypnol, and I can never pronounce this well, I think it's flunitrazepam. With like a lot of these PAM drugs, a lot of the psychotropics, I wouldn't be surprised if there are like 80 different pronunciations if you found 80 people. I call it flunitrazepam, okay? I'm not going to say it again. I'm just going to refer to it as Rohypnol. It's a very fast acting, okay, quick, okay, rate of onset. It's a potent benzodiazepine. Again, let's come back to that term, by the way, potency. What does that mean again? Does that mean like, oh my God, it's so strong? Not necessarily. Potent just means, if you remember back to the fundamental concept, potency means, okay, the amount of the drug that is required to produce the minimum psychoactive effect. Okay, so for example, LSD is one of the most potent psychoactive drugs because its effectiveness is measured in micrograms. Okay, it doesn't. Now, of course, that drug also happens to produce really strong. But you can say the same thing about cholesterol medication, right? It's like, yeah, like my grandma's cholesterol medication is really potent, bro. Like she trips out. No, it just means that, if she has potent cholesterol medication, it means that very little of that medication, as compared with others, right, that might be on the market, is required to produce the intended therapeutic effect of that cholesterol medication. Okay, so just remember, potency doesn't mean like, whoa, okay? It can mean that, especially if you take a lot of a potent medication. It just means that it does its job comparatively, okay, with far less of the substance. Okay, so it's a fast-acting, potent benzodiazepine that's often used, unfortunately, like I said, as a date rape drug. So in many sexual assault cases. Just to give you a sense of its potency, okay, it is 10 times more potent than Valium. That means, okay, you need 10 times the amount of Valium, okay, just all else being equal, to produce the same effect as a single dose of Rohypnol. Okay, that's what it's supposed to mean. It produces profound intoxication, especially like with most benzos and barbiturates, okay, when mixed with alcohol, a central nervous system depressant, or cannabis, but it's more often combined with alcohol, especially when it's used in sexual assault settings. That sounds like a terrible thing to say, sexual assault settings. Almost like normalizes it as something, okay? Like workplace settings. It's when it's used in horrific cases, because they all are horrific cases of sexual assault. It can cause severe impairment in the form of incapacitation and memory loss, both in the form of blackouts and brownouts. We've talked about that before, so I won't review that now. reports have surfaced of the drug being slipped into drinks. Of course, it's not like I'm like this just in. Like this was happening for a very long time. Um, and since that time, there have been many countermeasures that have been designed to prevent the use of Rohypnol in this way being slipped into someone's drink. Some countermeasures include, like a chemical that you can add to your drink that, when mixed with Rohypnol, will emit a very pungent odor. There's all these different things that but there are ways around it, unfortunately. Like for every formulation that's meant as a countermeasure to protect people, there's another one that's meant to hurt people even more. So it's a very sad thing. All right. And then we have a very similar kind of mixed bag drug, which is known as gamma hydroxybutyric acid. I think acid is in there too. I just know it as GHB. I cannot pronounce some of these chemical names. Organic chem was not my strong suit, as you could probably tell, right? But anyway, it's been used historically as an anesthetic, but its behavioral effects are very similar to profound alcohol intoxication. Okay, so it includes a lack of coordination, slurred speech. Okay, it's also considered, like Rohypnol, to be a date rape drug. It's usually sold on the street in small vials. We'll talk about other drugs that are sold in this way, by the way. It's actually a naturally occurring chemical in the brain, the structure of which, okay, is very similar to that naturally inhibitory neurotransmitter within our brains, GABA. Okay, so GABA is very similar in its chemical structure to the neurotransmitter GABA. It causes central nervous system depression, again, especially when combined with alcohol, which means that it's not only implicated in many sex assault cases, but it's also implicated it's also implicated as well in cases of overdose and death by suicide. Okay, in a much smaller, not smaller. It's also a very common club drug, so to speak. People use it when they're partying, okay? And less so, or to a lesser extent, it's been used in low doses within gym culture to build mass and burn fat. So not in combination with alcohol, but just on its own. This is far less the case today. Many other supplements have replaced something like GHB. Okay, so that brings us to, first, some general causes of concern for the sedative hypnotics. And you'll see we're going to get to the inhalants after this. And then we'll kind of bring everything together and compare alcohol from a very higher kind of level to these sedative hypnotics. Okay, so first of all, there's huge risk of psychological dependence. It's most likely when used for sleep and when using rapid acting forms. Okay, remember, psychological dependence is more likely when the rate of onset, okay, when the rate of onset of a drug is fast. Okay, the faster it is, the greater the risk of psychological dependence. And it's also more likely with inhalants. Remember, okay, there is a route of administration based reason that would increase the risk for psychological dependence. That's because inhalation is the fastest way to administer a drug into the body, and therefore to get it ultimately to the brain, right, where it needs to produce its effects. Inhalants, okay, are used via inhalation, okay, kind of like by definition. There's also a risk of physical dependence, right? So tolerance can develop pretty quickly for the benzos and the barbiturates, more so for the barbiturates, as we've talked about, and it's potentially life-threatening in terms of its withdrawal syndrome, okay? Especially when we're talking about large doses. So it's not just alcohol, but because alcohol and the benzodiazepines, and especially the barbiturates, are so closely linked, okay, in terms of their central nervous system activity, right, their pharmacodynamics, both are linked to a very serious withdrawal syndrome. In the case of barbiturate withdrawal, symptoms that are very similar to like stage 2 and stage 3 alcohol withdrawal. In the case of the benzodiazepines, it's generally less severe, but still includes a lot of the same symptoms you would find at stages 1 and 2, but it can progress to something that looks like stage 3 alcohol withdrawal in the case of very chronic and heavy use. I might try to share a video with you. I don't know if it's still in the class. I'd originally found it of a man who's going through extreme, right, like rare but very extreme and real benzodiazepine withdrawal. And as we know, cross dependence exists because cross tolerance exists. So, becoming dependent on the barbiturates means that you become dependent by that very nature on the benzodiazepines, which also means that you are at least predisposed to dependence on a substance like alcohol. Okay, if you have cross tolerance, okay, because you're in the same central nervous system family, you have cross dependence. And that brings us to toxicity. And again, remember, this is from the fundamental concepts. Okay, if you don't remember this, we have this kind of fourfold space of logical possibilities, right? So the first way that you define toxicity is by virtue of whether it's physiological, so mainly like organ based or like within the body in particular, or behavioral toxicity. So anything that affects thinking and problem solving and action, right? We classify under behavior, okay? And then you've got another division with respect to kind of time of onset and duration of effects, okay? So we have acute and chronic, okay? Acute means in the here and now, immediately. Chronic means over the long term, okay? So just as a quick reminder as we're using some of these terms. Now, I know they've been covered. I just want to make sure that you remember them for what's to come. So the behavioral toxicity of the sedative hypnotics, it produces a kind of alcohol-like intoxication with impaired judgment and coordination, even though, as we talked about before, they're synthetically engineered to be a little less messy than alcohol, say. But it's still an alcohol-like intoxication that impairs judgment and coordination, which means there's also an increased risk of injury while driving or engaging in any activities that require what we call, executive functioning, right? So like really good judgment and reaction time and attention, the ability to kind of perceive things clearly and, like as they're happening in the rear, in the here and now, in the rear. I was going to try to say, by the way, in the rear view mirror, I had that image in my mind. Okay, in the here and now. Oh my goodness. Maybe I shouldn't have done that wardrobe change earlier. That's probably the problem. Also, as you know, to get back to the seriousness of this, there are additive, right, synergistic effects when combined with any other central nervous system depressant, especially a pharmacologically messy one like alcohol. The physiological toxicity includes, like alcohol, respiratory depression. That's the scariest, especially when you combine it with alcohol. That is, again, respiratory depression is the number one cause of death, okay, associated with the central nervous system depressants. And by the way, they're close cousins, the opiates, as we'll be talking about next week. As we know, and as we've talked about in many ways now, in terms of those controversial topics and like specific demographics most associated with misusing these drugs are severely liable to misuse and abuse. Most of the abuse is associated with excessive oral use of legally manufactured products. That's a fancy way of saying we're not talking about street use here. We're not talking about people just like in a back alley, getting pills from someone out of a truck, right? This is usually people who have been prescribed, legal drugs, from a qualified prescribing physician, or in the case of alcohol, at least a legally manufactured product that has very little to no medicinal use other than sterilization, but that is widely accessible and legal as long as you are of age, right? We'll come back to this shortly when we talk about the inhalants. These are a special class of really frightening, legally manufactured and wild, like just widely accessible and available products that can cause some serious damage. As we noted earlier, there are three types of typical abusers. I won't go through them in detail again. These are older adults, younger people, and people who have some form of anxiety that is very likely not kind of a clinical condition requiring right pharmacological intervention. Okay, so that brings us, in terms of the benzodiazepines, slash barbiturates, that brings us to the last category we're going to briefly talk about, and again, very briefly, because we just can't get into, for one thing, just a lot of the controversy around this class of drugs. There is so much controversy. I just suggest, by the way, that you kind of look into this yourself. Look into the cases. For example, if you want some popular examples of this, look into the cases of Eminem, right? Who, by the way, just became a grandfather. That's pretty amazing, or at least will be a grandfather. I think his daughter is pregnant. That's crazy for me, by the way. Like, I grew up during a time when, like when I was a teenager, Eminem was just kind of starting out. Like, oh man, jeez, okay. And the case of Roseanne Barr and many other celebrities and popular figures who have used these benzodiazepine alternatives, these non-benzodiazepine hypnotics. In other words, sleeping agents. You may know of them under their popular names like Ambien and Lunesta. We're not going to get into that controversy, but the intention behind these drugs was that they are meant to be alternative to benzodiazepines that could act as hypnotics that seem to be far more useful for sleep, more selective for sleep than benzodiazepines. They have a very rapid onset and they're supposed to have a short duration of action like the barbiturates, but instead they bind selectively only to GABA A receptors. The point here is that by binding selectively to this class of receptors is, well, the hope, okay, this hasn't been borne out very well, is to avoid some nasty negative side effects, especially, like just kind of rebound insomnia, like next day drowsiness. There's a very severe risk of psychological and physical dependence associated with these drugs and many other complications, again, that I won't get into now. I would just suggest, if you're interested, look into this controversy, especially because these drugs are still widely used and prescribed and misused and abused, the whole gamut. Look into this in the scope of this kind of course. I am not going to take it upon myself to teach you all of that or to try to teach you that here.